Okay, just saying it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and thanks to Shadea and Zach for organizing this. So let's start with what should be an unobjectionable statement. Christianity is a religion. It has statements of faith, ritual practices, a discernible spiritual tradition, and a variety of other features that we identify when we talk about religions. Thus, Christianity's main dialogue partner, that to which it is most appropriately compared, should be other religions, such as Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Yet here's a surprising fact. Although interreligious dialogue is an important and relevant issue today, before the 20th century, Christianity was far less interested in other religions, instead preferring its main dialogue partner to be philosophy. To state the matter with a bit more insistence, Christianity, from its origins in the first century until today, has been far more concerned to present itself as the true philosophy rather than the true religion. Why is this the case, and why is it relevant for us today? Why has Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, been so insistent upon philosophy? And what does this have to do with the dialogue between religion and science? This is what I hope to explore in this talk. I hope to show that the success of the dialogue between science and religion depends in large part upon their mutual agreement about the value of the philosophical enterprise. The title of this talk, Saint Socrates, as a question, Saint Socrates as a saint, is a reference to Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great 16th century Catholic humanist, who once wrote, rather shockingly, Saint Socrates, pray for us. Socrates was, of course, a Greek philosopher who lived over 400 years before Christ, and this would not be a saint in our typical understanding of that word. But the holiness of Socrates is not a simple invention of the 16th century, as a similar sentiment can be found already in the 2nd century, in the writings of an early theologian named Justin Martyr. Justin was a pagan born around the year 100, and went from one philosophical school to another, becoming interested first in Stoicism, then Pythagoreanism, and then becoming a committed Platonist. That is to say, he was on the hunt for truth, not on what we would call any sort of religious quest. And he seemed to have no real interest in the Greek or Roman gods. And one day, while walking along a shoreline, he met an old man with whom he began to converse. Justin explains that he's a philosopher, and in fact defines philosophy, a definition that will serve equally well for our purposes here. He says, quote, "Philosophy then is the knowledge of that which really exists, and a clear perception of the truth, and happiness is the reward of such knowledge and wisdom." End quote. This definition is a perfectly good one, and one to which Plato, Aristotle, and a great many other philosophers would happily agree. It suggests that philosophy is a knowledge of what is really the case. It cuts past illusions and opinions and prejudices to arrive, as nearly as possible, to reality itself, to the truth. And instead of being a disinterested intellectual curiosity, which I fear is usually how philosophy is perceived today, its goal is happiness. Or as Plato would say, philosophy is for true lovers, lovers of wisdom who spurn all else in order to be truly wise. Okay, back to the story. The old man began to inquire about the Greek philosophers and what they could teach us, eventually demonstrating to Justin that they could not provide adequate answers to key questions, such as the nature of the soul. Then the old man says that there are philosophers who do have such answers, philosophers that Justin had never heard about. These philosophers, the old man explains, are Hebrews, and they are called prophets. This leads Justin to his eventual conversion, a conversion that he describes as a conversion to a new philosophy. Here's the quote. "When the old man had spoken these and many other things, which there is no time for mentioning at the present, he went away, bidding me to attend them, and I have not seen him since. But straightway a flame was enkindled in my soul, and a love of the prophets and of those men who are friends of Christ possessed me. And while revolving his words in my mind, I found this philosophy alone to be safe and profitable. Thus, and for this reason, I am a philosopher. Moreover, I would wish that all, making a resolution similar to my own, do not keep themselves away from the words of the Savior." End quote. Justin then famously began preaching the true philosophy, Christianity, all the while wearing the distinctive robe of the philosophers. As the name we give him indicates, Justin was eventually martyred for the faith, just as Socrates earlier was killed for disturbing the intellectual comfort of the Athenians. I wanted to begin with Justin because he, like Erasmus in the 16th century, also considered Socrates to be a Christian before Christ. And because he shows us that Christianity sees itself not as a mythology, not as a religious cult with truths of some inaccessible realm, but as the true philosophy that gives insight into the world as it is, which, as Justin said, leads to the only real happiness. And, as in the case of Socrates, Christianity finds friends among those who seek the truth, even if they have only discovered it in part. Let us analyze a bit more Christianity's relationship to philosophy before looking at some of the important implications. To state our initial point again, Christianity did not begin to seriously look at its own relationship to other religions and the potential truths in other religious traditions until about the 15th century, and not in any really fruitful way until the 20th century. But from the outset, Christians have been obsessed with philosophy. This is true not only of Justin Martyr, but equally of Augustine, Bonaventure, Aquinas, Cardinal Newman, of who this next lecture series is named, and Pope John Paul II, among countless others. I'm going to give a few important examples. St. Augustine. Much like Justin 2 centuries earlier, St. Augustine attributed his conversion to the truth firstly by discovering Platonism, which allowed him to see the inherent deception involved in his earlier religion as a Manichaean, which is a religion of the time that was based on the assumption that the world was a battleground between good and evil, with competing divinities. Platonism freed him from his search for truth in astrology and an analysis of the material causes alone, and gave him a vision of what is truly meant by the word God. Here's a quote from his Confessions. By reading these books of the Platonists, I had been prompted to look for truth as something incorporeal, and I caught sight of your invisible nature, as it is known through your creatures. He understood his conversion to Platonism as providing him with an accurate understanding of the nature of the world as it is, a wholly good world in which evil is only a corruption of reality, rather than a particular expression thereof. The world may indeed be filled with evils, but reality is itself reliable, trustworthy, and a means for arriving at a knowledge of the uncreated God. Platonism did not provide him with everything he needed to be truly happy and wise, which he discovers only in the love of Christ. But this conversion to philosophy was a necessary preparatory step for his later moral and religious conversion. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century is undoubtedly the one who best articulated the relationship between faith and reason, philosophy and theology. His basic position, which has been enormously influential on all subsequent Catholic theology, can be summarized in this way. While there's a critical distinction that needs to be made between philosophy and theology, between nature and grace, the distinction is not an opposition, but an indication of a fruitful relationship in which each presupposes and supports the other. First, the distinction. Philosophy proceeds by way of our natural capacities as human beings. And although we are prone to falling into innumerable errors, reason in itself is capable of seeing the world for what it is, which includes its dependence upon God and its fundamental goodness. Theology, on the other hand, is based upon revelation, which is to say that it is not a product of thinking really hard, but is primarily a gift from above. Philosophy cannot, for example, discover that God is triune, or that the second person of the Trinity became incarnate in Jesus Christ, all of which are revealed to humanity in Christ, and are thus the special topics of theological investigation. But again, this important distinction is not in opposition, for philosophy moves towards and supports what is discovered only by revelation. And once revelation has been given, it does not contradict or negate what was first discovered by the philosophical enterprise. One last thing before we turn to contemporary implications of Christianity's relationship to philosophy. Although I presented the majority report, and what is truly the dominant evaluation of philosophy by Christianity, we need to note the minority report, which must be taken into account. It is not the case that all Christians have agreed about the utility and benefits of philosophy for the Christian life. Let's return to Erasmus in the 16th century, with his decision to include Socrates in his Litany of the Saints. Erasmus's main theological opponent was his contemporary, Martin Luther, and Luther certainly did not share Erasmus's appraisal of humanistic and philosophical pursuits. In fact, Luther located many of the errors of Catholicism as its indebtedness to philosophical speculation, which he said tamed the radical newness of the Christian faith. Whether it is a fair analysis or not, Luther viewed Catholicism's error to lie in its use of pagan reason to dictate what may or may not be revealed by God. In other words, God is now only able to reveal truths that we decide beforehand would be reasonable and appropriate. Instead, Luther wanted Christianity to be seen not as a nice continuation and confirmation of human reason, but as something radically new, which condemns the idle speculations of reason. And we can also go back to the 2nd century. Justin Martyr's younger contemporary, Tertullian of Carthage, expressed a view not that dissimilar from Luther's. Rather than viewing Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle as allies in the discovery of truth, for Tertullian, they are rather culprits, as they mislead minds and draw people away from the revealed truths. He famously asks, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" For Tertullian, at least, the answer is nothing. Athens being, of course, the city of pagan philosophy, and Jerusalem, the city of divine revelation. Although our majority tradition would want to see Athens and Jerusalem as sister cities, as cities with a relatively open immigration policy and friendly trading relations, for the minority tradition of Tertullian and Luther, these cities are at war with one another, as each is making totalizing claims regarding the truth. For Tertullian, there can only be one possible winner, and we should see to it that it is the faith that wins. Although I'm not wholly sympathetic to this position, and it is entirely at odds with the teaching of the modern Catholic magisterium, we need to see what is true and helpful about this oppositional approach to philosophy. Today, perhaps more than ever, this is a rather tempting proposition. Yet, ironically, as we will note later, it is actually the scientific materialist that falls into this temptation more than does the Christian. Here's some evidence to support Tertullian and Luther, as well as a whole host of other figures that prioritize faith to the expense of reason. This is a position known as fideism, or faithism. And again, later we will discuss a scientific form of fideism. As support for this position, we can note St. Paul's warning to the Colossians, quote, "See to it that no one makes you a prey by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ." Rather than viewing philosophy as the handmaiden to theology, as did Aquinas, for St. Paul it seems that philosophy can equally be the agent of distraction and confusion. And thus here's the place to admit that philosophy is not one thing. It is not a simple and univocal category. There are countless philosophies, many of which are self-contradictory or examples of what St. Paul calls empty deceit. Instead of leading one towards the truth, there are plenty of philosophies, from ancient skepticism to postmodern deconstruction, that will have you questioning whether truth is a meaningful category in the first place. Thus, to continue with Tertullian, it is better to avoid Athens altogether. For is it not the case that whatever good could theoretically be found in Athens, it can equally be found in Jerusalem? And there, in the holy city, we do not need to decide between warring philosophical schools, to decide whether Stoicism or Pythagoreanism is better, or David Hume or Immanuel Kant, but simply accept the truths given to us by revelation. For example, while Plato could provide a rather elegant list of virtues, such as our 4 cardinal virtues, and good advice for how to live a moral life, he was unaware entirely of the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. Further, no philosopher before Christ recognized humility as a virtue, while for Christians it is a supreme virtue exemplified in Jesus' own life. Why, again, bother with these incomplete truths based in reason when revelation provides us with wisdom incarnate? Okay, finally, to make one more case for the anti-philosophical position. While perhaps it was the case that philosophy can be an aid to faith, as seen, for example, in Augustine's use of Plato or Aquinas' use of Aristotle, that philosophy simply no longer exists. Is philosophy, as it is typically taught in modern universities, a search for wisdom, let alone a love of wisdom? Would a Philosophy 101 class today inspire students to ask the fundamental questions? Does human life make sense? Do I have a destiny? Is the world simply change and flux, or does it have a stability to it? Is the world intelligible and meaningful, or simply the screen on which I project my desires? I won't even ask the question of whether these classes would encourage and foster growth in the virtues, which for Plato were actually the prerequisites for the philosophical enterprise. If all that is the case, perhaps it is best if philosophy and theology were simply to go their separate ways. If philosophy as it is actually practiced today seems to be more of a hindrance to truth than a means of access to it, there seems to be no point in insisting upon it any longer. In fact, perhaps Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, is guilty of propping up and insisting upon philosophical studies to the detriment of human flourishing. For instance, what good does it to do to make Catholic seminarians study 2 years of philosophy before they begin studying theology? Why waste time in Athens when Jerusalem is where the true answers are to be found? Okay, how then are we to decide between these two rival interpretations of philosophy? Should we side with Justin Martyr or Tertullian? Is Christianity supported by and ever indebted to philosophy, or is faith the destruction and replacement of all vain philosophizing? We can answer this question, at least in part, by looking at some of the implications of each position. First, we need to ask this question: what kind of gift is Christianity? We already specified that it is a gift, as it comes from revelation, from the self-manifestation of God and Jesus Christ. But what kind of gift might it be? There seems to be two main options. First, it could be a complete surprise, a gift given without any desire or expectation for such a gift. Second, it could be the long anticipated gift, the gift that is given to an eager recipient. For the anti-philosophical strain of the tradition, Tertullian, Luther, the answer would be the former. Christianity would be a gift that were given out of the blue, as it were. As the speculations of reason do not anticipate or support Christianity, faith is given as something totally new, as something discontinuous with the normal flow of human life and thought. There's something true about this. Faith is a gift from God, not just a natural continuation of rational thought. Our ideas about God and the world do not override and dictate how God may reveal himself. A gift given simply out of generosity, a gift given not on your birthday or Christmas, but simply as a token of affection, a gift that the recipient has never heard of before, is indeed a wonderful thing. Yet there's also a risk. An undesired gift can also be an unwanted gift. The gift could remain unused at best, or serve as a source of embarrassment at worst. For our philosophy-friendly tradition of Justin, Augustine, and Aquinas, on the other hand, the answer is the latter. That is to say, while Christianity is new and unexpected, it is also the fulfillment of a natural desire and aptitude. It is a gift given with full awareness that the recipient would be overjoyed to receive such a thing. While the philosopher would not have written Christianity at the top of his Christmas list, as if philosophy knew perfectly what it was expecting, it is nevertheless the case that Christianity is here seen as a gift perfectly attuned to the often ambiguous desires of the philosophical mind. The gift was given beyond any expectation, but once received, it is recognized as something that was always implicitly desired. Is it not the most marvelous kind of gift exchange when the gift was both unexpected and yet immediately recognized as necessary? A lover can know the beloved better than she knows herself, and thus give a gift that the beloved does not consciously know she wants, but does in fact truly need. The birth of a child is like this, totally gratuitous, yet once given, seen to have been totally necessary all along. Can a mother even imagine a world without that child in it? No matter the supposed advantage of the anti-philosophical position, it is clear that it results in innumerable difficulties. We could note that it makes evangelization an impossibility, given that there is no longer any point of contact between non-believers and Christians. If God and the nature of the human person cannot be known by reason, how does it make sense to preach that God has become man in Christ? Further, the anti-philosophical position is vulnerable to making religion into a cult. If reason has no regulatory function whatsoever, if our innate sense of right and wrong, true and false is denigrated, then any religion can easily become irrational and even inhumane. This position also permanently damages Christianity's relationship to science, a question to which we can now turn. Although many contemporary scientists would deny it, every scientific claim either constructs or presupposes a philosophical worldview and works within a philosophical realm. Usually it is a simple presupposition without an elaboration. Science is, of course, an ambiguous word, given that it simply comes from the Latin word for knowledge, scientia. It is perhaps better to call it science by its older name, which is simply natural philosophy, the philosophy of the natural world that can be analyzed empirically. How, though, do our two strands of Christian thought relate to challenges issuing from scientific discoveries? The anti-philosophical temperament will also tend to be an anti-scientific one. Because there is no correspondence between philosophical knowledge and theological wisdom, there will also be no clear relationship between scientific analysis of the world and biblical descriptions thereof. That is because the anti-philosophical temperament presupposes that we are dealing with two different worlds: a suspect world of nature, philosophy, and reason, and a supernatural world described in the Bible. There will be no obvious bridge between one world and the other, and descriptions of the natural world will be considered incommensurable with descriptions of this supernatural one. Thus, descriptions of the natural world that are seemingly in conflict with the biblical world, such as evolution, the age of the planet, the historical veracity of certain biblical events, such as the flood, will be rejected as the muddled and vain ambitions of a human mind unconnected to divine revelation. That is to say, the type of Christianity that has always been wary of philosophical insights also tends to be the type of Christianity that is fearful of, or at least uncomfortable with, a scientific mode of thought. Again, the major problem with this now anti-scientific Christianity is not in its particular decisions regarding biblical interpretation, or even its uneasiness with particular scientific decisions, but rather in its theologically dubious notion that we are in fact living in two separate worlds, one of unquestionable certainty because of the witness of revelation, and the other of simple confusion, error, and vanity according to human reason. Okay, now we can finally leave behind the anti-philosophical and the anti-scientific mode of Christian thought behind, and look at how the philosophically oriented viewpoint of those such as Justin Martyr and Thomas Aquinas can lend us insights in how to deal with the supposedly conflicting methods of science and religion. First, we should note that Christianity has largely insisted upon the integrity and validity of the scientific enterprise, just as it has for philosophy. There are, of course, some exceptions to this, such as the Galileo affair, but in this case, the exceptions truly do prove the rule. Without going into any details of the historical record about this or any other supposed conflict between science and religion, we will be looking at only one point at which there is true conflict between contemporary science and Christian faith. That conflict is not, as is perhaps imagined, about evolution or the age of the earth, but revolves around the question of the scope and the range of the scientific enterprise. The real conflict that arises between faith and science is not due to any particular claim regarding physics, biology, or any other discipline that science alone properly treats. Instead, the conflict arises when science, so rightly infatuated with the truth of its own discoveries, ceases to regard any other mode or form of knowledge as truthful. Christianity finds science to be invaluable because it does what no other mode of discourse can do: analyze the physical universe in all its depth and complexity, and make arguments precisely about the physical composition of the world. Revelation is not in the business of making claims primarily about the physical order, and it is a gross misreading of the creation narratives in Genesis to consider their primary aim to be something akin to scientific claims regarding the physical composition or origin of the natural world. Thus, although there have been innumerable Christians who have advanced the project of modern science, they are valuable precisely as scientists, not for attempting to import knowledge from Christian revelation into their physics or chemistry, for example. To simplify the matter, we can say that the conflict between science and faith arises because of a scientific overreach. Cardinal John Henry Newman, for whom this lecture series is named, summarized the issue quite nicely in the 19th century, and his insight applies equally well today. Here's a quote. Quote, "I believe that the study of nature, when religious feeling is away, leads the mind, rightly or wrongly, to acquiesce in the atheistic theory as the simplest and the easiest. It is but parallel to that tendency in anatomical studies, which no one will deny, to solve all phenomena of the human frame into material elements and powers, and to dispense with the soul. To those who are conscious of matter, but not conscious of mind, it seems more rational to refer all things to one origin, such as they know, rather than to assume the existence of a second origin, such as they know not. It is religion, then, which suggests to science its true conclusions. The facts come from knowledge, but the principles come from faith." end quote. The point Newman is making is this: a physicist or a psychologist or a chemist will tend to see the world and its truth as predominantly or solely physical, psychological, or chemical, respectively. That the world is physical and chemical and accessed via the psyche of an individual mind is not to be doubted. But just as Christian revelation has recognized the necessary sphere of the philosophical mode of thought, which it does not replace, so science too needs to recognize that the world is describable far beyond the confines of any one scientific branch. That is to say, science must be understood as one partial aspect of the description of the world, no matter how valuable or irreplaceable it may be in that realm. It is thus ultimately subservient to a philosophical worldview. It is with great caution that I would disagree with a newly canonized saint, such as Newman, but I think we can clarify the quote above that we just read. It is not primarily or initially religion that suggests to science its true conclusions, as Newman said, but rather metaphysics. So just what is metaphysics? If science deals with a physicality of what is, understood most broadly to include not just physical mass, but also waves, particles, energy, laws, and all the rest, metaphysics deals with the world not only as it shows itself in its physicality, but as it is in itself. Science can describe beings, entities, the whole variety of entities that present themselves within the physical universe. But it is incapable of saying anything about being with a capital B. Metaphysics is concerned with the being of all particular beings, the question of how the totality of all things is in fact a coherent unity. We will return to this in a moment, but for now we can simply clarify Newman by saying that all science utterly depends on some or another metaphysical or philosophical worldview. Christianity does have a problem with scientific materialism, but the problem is not with the scientific aspect, but with the presumed materialism. Materialism is the worldview that all that exists, or could possibly exist, could be detected, at least theoretically, by some experiment or evidence within the physical order, and that there could be no spiritual or metaphysical reality that escapes scientific analysis. Just as Newman noted, many scientists are in fact committed philosophical materialists, which is a philosophical position that cannot be proven by scientific facts alone. Here we can note that scientific materialism functions just as our anti-philosophical Christianity did earlier. Whereas anti-philosophical Christianity reduces all certain knowledge to faith alone, because it is so convinced of the truth of Scripture, so the materialist reduces all knowledge to what can be discovered within the physical world alone. This too is based on the presumption that the only sure path to knowledge is based on faith alone, even if in this case it is faith solely in the material composition of the world rather than faith in a divine revelation. We can quote a contemporary scientist to confirm this analysis. Quote, "The arguments for materialism are completely circular. They all seem to boil down in the end to materialism is true because materialism must be true. The fact seems to be that the philosophy of materialism is completely fideistic in character." Again, faith alone, okay? End quote. Faith in materialism forbids the possibility of an immaterial soul or of God who utterly transcends the physical universe. It alone cannot, of course, directly argue against these positions, but instead dismisses them outright for being in conflict with the chosen creed of materialism. No monotheist, whether Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, or otherwise, had ever argued that God could be detected within the physical universe. And thus the inability of the microscope or the telescope to detect God could be equally an argument for the existence of God as it is an argument against it. The service that metaphysics provides at this point is that it opens up science to be something that is utterly and irrevocably valid within its own domain, and yet also inherently finite and limited within the greater scope of all that is possibly knowable. If science is to be true, it can only be true within a metaphysical horizon in which being itself is understood to be reliable, trustworthy, and capable of comprehension. To understand why science needs a metaphysical vocabulary, we can turn to a concrete example of the notion of creation. Here's where it seems that a Christian philosophical viewpoint and a scientific materialist viewpoint have little hope of understanding one another. When Christians speak about creation, they are not speaking about the earliest moment in time, or the earliest stuff out of which the universe is now composed. Instead, to speak about creation means to speak about how being, with a capital B, is different from nothing. For according to the theological tradition, creation occurs from nothing, creatio ex nihilo. To think seriously about the nature of created being, then, is to understand its difference from nothing. Nothing understood in its full philosophical import. The claim about creation is that the being of the universe has no foundation within itself, but arose out of a pure spontaneity and generosity of God. This is fundamentally a metaphysical, philosophical issue, not one that can be addressed in any way by the scientific method or the scientific mind, but only by the philosophical or metaphysical mind. The scientific mind, as it often presents itself today, can only discuss the physical nature of things, no matter how flexibly the term physical is interpreted, to include waves, energy, particles, etc. But even then, even when we are speaking about quarks and leptons, we are still speaking about materiality, philosophically speaking. While the scientific materialist presumes that the Christian notion of creation can be explained away if material causes prior to the Big Bang can be discovered, the philosopher knows that the question of creation is not the same as the question of the Big Bang, about the expansion of an initially extremely dense and unimaginably compact matter. The Big Bang is perhaps an explanation of the expansion of the universe, but it does not even touch the philosophical question of the difference between nothing and something. The question at root, both philosophically and theologically, when we are discussing creation is the following: why is there something rather than nothing? This question is not the same as asking about how did the things we now have come about from other things, and about how early we can trace such things, even if it is traced to things that seem to be nothing, such as quantum fluctuations. Instead, this question is a metaphysical question, or perhaps the metaphysical question par excellence. And because it is dealing with the question of how all beings whatsoever came to be and remain in being, it is a question that arises primarily out of wonder. And wonder is the point at which the theologian, the philosopher, and the scientist should all agree. As Aristotle said long ago in his book called Metaphysics, quote, "It is owing to their wonder that men both now begin, and at first began, to philosophize," end quote. All great philosophers have noted that philosophy begins as an act of awe or wonder, the Greek word being thaumasin, simply awe at the fact that anything is, that there is something rather than nothing. Pavel Florensky, a contemporary or Russian Orthodox theologian and philosopher who was martyred in the Russian Gulag in 1937, noted this well, tying it into the spiritual life. Quote, "To be a philosopher is always to perceive reality as something new, as something that is never boring or stale. The adventure of the spiritual life consists in the fact that everything is renewed, first in one's consciousness and then outside oneself." End quote. Wonder at being is also, I would propose, the origin of science, which seeks to move past our always partial viewpoints, our rather chaotic experience of the flux and change of the world, to arrive at reality as it is in itself, to the truthfulness of being, to the marvel that the world is in fact intelligible. Yet for the philosophical materialist, all things must be explainable as material causes. Thus, even things that are quite obviously non-material, such as love, ideas, and minds, are explained in terms that are purely physical. Love is nothing more than the firing of certain synapses, an evolutionary trick in order to propagate the species. Wonder at being, which the materialist also felt, is now simply a holdover from our animal past. It is fear arising from the need for survival. And the mind itself, our own reflective self-consciousness, simply becomes an epiphenomenon of the brain, something like heat emitted from a motor. Although this line of thinking ultimately undermines the scientific enterprise as a whole, given that truth is no longer a meaningful category, the largest problem with it is that it is based upon a logical fallacy. Mistaking a partial explanation for a total explanation The materialist assumes that noting some physical phenomenon removes the necessity of looking for prior or supplementary causes as well. For instance, although drinking wine can be shown to release endorphins, it would be wrong to say that we drink wine solely in order to release those endorphins. Teenagers drink wine in order to break rules. Couples drink wine to properly celebrate anniversaries. Jews drink wine to celebrate Passover, and Christians drink wine to commune in Christ's blood. The endorphins released in each case is actually the least interesting thing about it, although it is the only thing the materialist can see. All of this is not to reignite a supposed controversy between science and religion. Instead, I am simply trying to note that the problem that Christianity sees in a certain type of scientific materialism has nothing at all to do with its scientific method or conclusions, but with its implicit philosophy that it itself usually does not recognize. It is thus a battle between philosophies, between differing metaphysical conceptions of the world. One philosophy sees the world as an accumulation of measurable entities, as a world whose truth is theoretically exhaustible, a world with nothing beyond physics, that is to say, without any metaphysics. It is thus a philosophy that limits knowledge and forbids certain questions, such as, why is there something rather than nothing? The other philosophy, the one endorsed by Catholicism, but equally found among peoples of other faiths, as well as people with no particular faith at all, speaks of a world in which being ever outstrips particular beings, a world that is never fully comprehensible, a world that is not there primarily to be measured, but to be wondered at. The main point I would like to emphasize here is that there are serious problems with any worldview that insists upon a cognitive dissonance. The anti-philosophical mode of Christianity is fundamentally cognitively dissonant in that it admits of one mode of thought, namely that of reason, and a wholly separate one, namely that of faith, between which the believer navigates only with major breaks and interruptions. Further, a worldview dictated by materialism also results in a fundamentally dissonant and incongruous experience. The materialist lives in a world not only of brute facts and objects to be experimented upon, but also a world of consciousness, a world of love for family and friends, a world of awe and wonder. Yet there is no real relationship between these two worlds for the materialist, who instead only considers as real that which is scientifically verifiable, while all else, which actually constitutes the materialist's lived experience, is deemed to be ultimately illusory. When our materialist tucks his child into bed at night, he knows that the love he feels for that child is only a byproduct of the genetic need to preserve the species, resulting in a split mind, a real schizophrenia. Instead, what I am proposing here is that we need to view the world as fundamentally one. This applies not only to the scientist, but to the believer as well. Yes, there are things that we discover by revelation that are not known by philosophy or science. And there are things discovered by science that are not the proper realm of theological studies, such as genomic sequencing. But the theologian, the philosopher, and the scientist all dwell in one and the same world. And any knowledge discovered about that world is ultimately significant for all three. To better conceptualize this point, we can turn to two rather well-known paintings by the Renaissance painter Raffaello, which are held in the Vatican museums. I'll share my screen, see if I can do it. Can you see it? The first is entitled The School of Athens, which hopefully is on your screen. In it, you see all the major philosophers of antiquity discussing and debating the nature of being. We could consider it to be a picture of a metaphysical debate. In the center are Plato and Aristotle, with Plato pointing up as a sign of his characteristic emphasis on the priority of the intellectual world, and Aristotle pointing down, illustrating his emphasis on the concrete materiality of the world. Yet we can also include modern-day scientists in our picture here. For even when they do not philosophize, that is to say, think about the relationship between the ideal and the real, the necessary and the contingent, the absolute and the finite, they are still describing the world inhabited by the rest of us. Note one important thing about this picture. The vaults of the heaven above are rather bare. For our purposes, we could say that the philosophers and scientists recognize the presence of God as a necessary intellectual postulate, but it is a rather bare sketch rather than a fleshed out picture. The next painting, which should be on your screen, is directly facing the School of Athens in the Vatican Museum, just right across the room. This painting, called La Disputa del Sacramento, or the Disputation about the Sacrament, portrays a debate among theologians concerning the status and the nature of the Eucharist, perhaps with some theologians emphasizing the symbolism of the sacrament and others the real presence. What I take to be most important here, though, is that the size, the proportions, and the frame of this painting are exactly the same as they are in the School of Athens across the room. Thus, even though we are an obviously theological world here, rather than a philosophical or scientific one, it is clear that we are discussing the same world, rather than a separate spiritual sphere unconnected to the world of the philosopher or the scientist. Of course, we do have new things here in the theological picture, most conspicuously the heavens that are filled out, not only with the triune God, but also Mary, the saints, and the angels. Therefore, the vault of the philosopher is filled out in detail, no longer simply the God of Aristotle, the God of the philosophers, self-thinking thought, actus purus, ens a se, but now the God of Jesus Christ, who reveals himself in his own flesh and in the sacraments of the church. But note well that the Eucharist is on the lower plane, which is to say that it too can be analyzed by the philosopher and the scientist. The theologian does not and should not dispute such a fact. For as has always been recognized, nothing about the physicality or the materiality of the sacrament changes in transubstantiation. What changes is the substance, which is a philosophical and metaphysical notion, not a properly scientific one. Thus, the scientist too can come and adore Christ, recognizing that our descriptions of materiality, no matter how robust, illuminating, and even inspiring, never can exhaust a reality in which God can manifest himself in and through the materiality of bread and wine. We conclude then by returning to Tertullian's question: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? If Athens is represented by the first picture, the School of Athens, and Jerusalem by La Disputa, our answer will be everything. They have everything to do with one another, for human beings live not only in Athens, the world of philosophy, but also in Jerusalem, the world of faith. And the reverse is also true, which is why faith ever needs philosophy, why every believer must also be a philosopher. To theologize is not simply to have more answers and more certainty, but to also live in a state of philosophical wonder and awe, even if that awe is extended to include not only the physical and metaphysical world, but also a theophanic world, a world filled with God's glory. And the scientist too must recognize that Athens itself is far more complex, textured, and interesting than simply analyzing the tiles on the floor. That is the service that philosophy in general, and metaphysics in particular, can provide to the scientist, to show that the world of reason, is a world to be wondered at, a world of inexhaustible meaning and potential. And to return to our definition of philosophy by Justin Martyr, the truth to be discovered may certainly include noting predictable sequences and patterns in the material universe, but the primary aim of the philosophical life is to discover reality in its plenitude so as to be truly happy. Even the scientist is able to recognize that Athens, when seen in all its fullness, which is both material and immaterial, begins to look more and more like Jerusalem. Thank you.